In this video we'll be making this router table with a sliding fence, a real cheap but perfectly functioning way to make your own router lift system, and everything to do with dust extraction, such as a dust box and this mesmerizing blast gate box to connect with my dust extractor. Hi, I'm Til of Mate, and before you go any further, this is part 2 of the Workbench Build series I made, so if you haven't seen part 1 yet, I'll put a link in the description below, so check that out first. I'm starting with the insert plate and I'm using this material mainly known as Trespa. Trespa is an extremely strong material and even this piece of 6mm thick almost doesn't bend. The first step is to cut the insert plate at the right size to make a jig for the hole in the tabletop. To make this jig I need 4 straight pieces of plywood, a snack and my pocket hole drill jig. I took the plywood pieces and drilled 2 holes in every piece on one end. Placed them around the insert plate and screwed them together, making sure they form a tight fit around the insert plate and pop it back out. First I'm using the jig on this piece of plywood, which will reinforce the tabletop. Since my tabletop is MDF and there will be some weight hanging underneath, I wanted to make sure it won't sag over time. I'm using my good old router table again and I love this thing. It's so easy to set up and it just works like a charm every... Using double-sided tape, I stick the jig to our reinforcement piece and I route the axis with a flush trim bit over at the router table. Oh, and don't mind the burn marks, I know, it's bad. I might need to spend some time cleaning my bits. When that's done, I check if the insert plate fits, and it seems to fit perfectly. Maybe slightly too big. I mark the position of the insert plate on the tabletop and I cut out the majority with a jigsaw. And I make sure to cut as close as possible to my marking line, so there's as little as possible MDF left to route. Then I place the reinforcement piece underneath and I attach it with pocket hole screws. And finally I route the MDF flush with the reinforcement piece. Oh, and don't forget to wear your mask. Next we're going to make the micro height adjustments and I need 4 big and 4 small pieces. The dimensions for everything on this build can be found in the plans on my website. There's a link in the description if you're interested in building your own workbench, and it's also a way to just support the channel. It allows me to keep making these videos and it's greatly appreciated. You just saw me cutting off these little corners to fit into the round insert plate opening. After that I glue up the pieces together with just glue and clamps and enjoy the view from my shop and let the glue dry overnight. The next day I take off the clamps and it's time to drill like a zillion holes. I start with screw holes to mount the micro adjusters underneath the tabletop. Apparently I did the countersinking first, I don't know why, just go with it and don't ask questions I guess. These 2 holes are for the height adjustment bolts and need to be a tight fit. And the last hole will fit a threaded insert to fix the insert plate to the workbench. And finally I cut off this corner for aesthetic reasons and less chance to hurt yourself. Cutting small pieces on the table saw can be quite dangerous, so I made this quick clamping jig for a safe and constant cutting. Sometimes inserting threaded inserts can be such a pain to get them perfectly straight. I found this technique with a threaded rod, 2 bolts and a hand drill, and it came out great. It's time to mount them to the workbench, and for this I used the longest screws possible. The insert plate still has square corners, so I sand them by hand until they fit perfectly. Back to the insert plate itself. Here I'm drilling the holes to mount the router underneath. Then I screw the insert plate to a piece of plywood. It will make the insert plate even stronger, and I need some kind of support for the reducing or insert rings later on. Here I'm drilling a hole in every corner to fit the bolt that will go in the threaded insert in the micro adjustments. The last hole I need to drill is the one to set the router lift mechanism, and I need to disassemble the router to mark where this will be. I have the Hitachi M12VE plunge router. The same router can be found by the brand Hikoki and Metabo. These are really affordable routers with a powerful engine of 2000 watt, which will hardly slow down. The router lift I'm making here will also fit the DeWalt DW625, which is an older router but the same principle. And I'm not saying you need these routers. You might be even better off with a Triton or a Festool router, but I happen to have this one on hand. And more importantly, it almost cost me nothing. But more on that later. Here I just routed an opening in the insert plate and the plywood that goes underneath. As you can see, the hole in the plywood is slightly smaller, which results in a small rabbet where the reducing rings can be placed into. Next, I'm routing some grooves to fit the T-tracks for the sliding fence and another one for the miter track. The T-track grooves need to be square on one end, and I just used a chisel for that. A threaded rod, 1 bolt, 4 washers and 6 nuts. No, those other nuts. Right. That's all you need to make this router lift. 2 nuts to stop the router at its lowest point, a bolt to set the height, 3 nuts to connect the bolt with the rod, and the rod that does the lifting of another nut inside a piece of wood mounted on the router. And yeah, I know it's not ideal. A threaded rod isn't made to withstand friction, but only traction. But you can minimize the friction with oil, and I'm sure it will last longer than we tend to think, especially as a hobby. And if eventually it starts to wear out, I'll replace the rod and the nut, and it'll cost me €2. I did design the insert plate a little smaller than commercial router lifts in case I ever want to upgrade. Next I'm routing 2 insert rings. I didn't go all the way through, left some material and cracked them like a cookie. It's time to put some finish on the top, and I'm using Rubio monocoat. I have a bunch of their stuff because I used their products in my previous business. And the second reason I'm using their product is I did some tests with wood glue, and of all the finishes I've tried, it came off the easiest with Rubio monocoat. The lift system is done, the tabletop is finished, now we can make the sliding fence. I mark and cut all the pieces according to the dimensions in the plans and cut out this recess where the router bit is located. Next I'm making these triangular pieces which will make sure the sliding fence remains square, and I screw everything together. In this shot you can see how easy it is to do this thanks to the T-track in the side. I clamp it flush with the tabletop, and this way there's full support on the workpiece. I made those triangular pieces a bit too long on purpose, so I can cut them flush on the table saw. Here I'm drilling a hole to fit the hose for the dust extraction right behind the router bit. I'm using a radius bit so it's easier to plug the hose in, and I mount it on the sliding fence. When that's done, I needed to cut a miter on an extruded piece of aluminium. But there's nothing I hate more than working with metal. It always creates a massive amount of very small metal parts flying around the shop. It's noisy and everything is way too sharp. So I asked my dad to cut the miter while I was watching him from a distance. Let me show you the mess it made. But also the magic. I'm going to make some DIY star knobs for locking the sliding fence in place. I'm using the templates from my build plans and glue them onto the pieces of plywood, and I cut out the shape with a jigsaw. I applied a coat of blue oil because I thought it'd be nice to add some color, and I clamped them on a jig to chamfer all the edges to reveal back the white birch wood. I'm using these threaded inserts, and you can use a hammer to slam them in their place, but it was getting late, so I went with a silent way and pressed them in place with a clamp. I inserted the T-nuts, a washer, and added a short metal tube and the star knobs I just made. The T-nuts slide into the T-tracks from earlier, and when tightening, this thing is really locked in place. Now let's make the dust box. The dust box is basically a small cabinet that goes over the router. It will have a door with a window, a connection for dust extraction, and a gap to pull the power cable through. I used pocket holes to put it together, and here again you can see the benefits of the workbench when making things like this. For the door I'm using the jig I made at the beginning of this video. I cut out the majority with a jigsaw, used double-sided tape, and it's basically the same thing like before. When routing the rabbit for the window, things didn't go as planned. I was being stupid and was holding my piece with one hand only. But in the end, it looked worse than it was. And let me give you a woodworking tip, says the guy who's routing one-handed. Anyway, train yourself to pull away your hands. I've been doing this since I started woodworking, and basically it's just a mindset. You might want to grab your workpiece, but you'll end up with your hands in the thing that cuts. So keep your eyes on the spinning thing, always know where it is, pull away your hands and turn out the machine. Okay, this is the last part. Bear with me, we're almost there. Here I'm making the blast gate box. I used hole saws for the hose connector and the blast gate. Luckily I did this at the end of the day because my drill overheated and it had to cool down. Actually I thought I broke it, but the next day it came back to life. For this I didn't use pocket holes because they would be visible and they tend to catch dust. I wanted the inside of the blast gate box smooth so there's no chance of clogging up. So I used biscuits to glue things together. I placed it aside to dry and still had to find a way to make the dust extraction for the dust box. My dad has always kept so much spare parts in the shop, and there's this box with connectors and hoses of different vacuum cleaners. Some digging later I found exactly what I needed for the dust box. Back to the Blastgate box. The glue is dry and I still have to cut off the excess. I cut the majority on the table saw and finished with a handsaw. And you might have already noticed there's something wrong. And if you didn't, now you do. I still have no idea what I did wrong and the whole thing was crooked. Eventually I had to go over the planer with it until this one side was flat. But I decided to spare you this tedious process and move on. I routed the rabbet for the plexiglass and made the corner square with a chisel. And lastly, I attached the blast gate and a 4-inch hose connection. All there's left to do is creating a connection between the blast gate box and the dust box, which will be mounted on the panel to the right of the router lift. After figuring out the right position, I dismounted the plywood piece and drill a hole with a hole saw. I mark where the blast gate box will be and drill some screw holes. Next, I drill another hole in the dust box and I tape the edges with some soft rubber tape for a tight and detachable fitting of the dust connection. I use the same tape on the blast gate box to make sure there's no air leaks and also remains detachable. It's time to put everything in place, but first I added a safety switch with a power socket to plug in the router. The small gap you see will fit the power cable of the router. I just detach the door and the power cord stays in its place. So, this workbench is officially done, and if you got this far in the video, I cannot thank you enough. Making, filming and editing this workbench was a big take on this adventure, and with this I'm officially launched with Wygon Made. I'm hoping to make some furniture from now on, so if you'd like to see me building real furniture in the future, like this video and most importantly subscribe to this channel and maybe even send it to a friend. I hope you liked this video. Thank you for watching and see you on the next one.